2, 1. And we're live. Okay, so I've actually been meaning to reach out to this person for a while. They've been following me on Twitter on both this the Insanity is Free account and Weekly Hellscape for a while now. So it'll be nice to get their perspective on a few things, because there are some things, you know, that I want some clarification on. There's some things that I was interested in talking about, various topics that'll be interesting. But before we get into that, I just wanted to say this is sponsored by Brave, Cash App, fucking Necrotopia, Coinbase. Any of the links in the description that you see are links that you can click, including one to buy his books. You can click that link and it'll take you to the Amazon author page, and if you buy any of his books and anything else that's in your cart when you do that, will support the show. So I would greatly appreciate that, and I'm sure he would too. All that being said, I think it's best if you introduced yourself. You've been featured on Foundation for Economic Education, Being Libertarian, Think Liberty, Porter Medium, and more. But what made you want to get into this in the first place?
It actually started, as far as my writing goes, actually I started writing more on Ireland and their politics over there, specifically Northern Ireland. I was following heavily the collapse of the Northern Irish government a few years ago, and they actually to this day have still not reestablished their government. They're talking things out, apparently. And so I started looking at that more from a libertarian perspective and started contributing some articles to the Freedom Today network, since they're based out of Europe. And that the response I got was really tremendous and really encouraging. Even though it's an American commenting on European politics, a lot of people seemed intrigued. So from that kind of snowballed into focusing more on American politics and American issues. So I had to basically write about another country before I could write about America. Is basically how that got in. But it was really just started out kind of as a way to vent. I've been writing since I was a little kid, so it's always been kind of cathartic. And I was really upset with how the political parties in Northern Ireland were handling their situation, and ended up just kind of expressing it in an article, and I submitted it on a whim. And from there, it's just kind of snowballed to where I was able to start writing for FEE a little bit, Being Libertarian, Think Liberty, now that they're an affiliate of Being Libertarian. And then that eventually led back in May to Porter Medium, which is a new media startup from the East Coast. And they tapped me to be a libertarian opinion writer for them as well. So I've been contributing heavily to them over the last 2 months now that their site has launched. So yeah, it all kind of started. Writing is always something I wanted to do, but it just kind of started on a whim and a rant on another country, and then just kind of snowballed into where we are today.
All right, and while we're on the subject of you specifically, on your site it has you being introduced to liberty by a close friend. Is that friend the guy in the military in that picture there?
No, that's my brother.
Gotcha.
So he's an Air Force pilot. But so I was living in Daytona Beach at the time, and it was a friend of mine, a coworker, and it was 2015. We're gearing up for the 2016 election, and I was just, like I usually am around election time, I was just kind of exhausted from it. And because for years, nothing politically has ever seemed to align with what I thought. And at the time, I had never really considered libertarianism or the liberty philosophy. And because I was kind of seeing the fringe element being portrayed, and I thought, well, I don't know if that's exactly what I want to be like. And then a friend of mine came up to me and said, "Have you heard about Gary Johnson?" And I know from a libertarian perspective, was he the best candidate and this and that? Probably not. But it intrigued me enough to start reading more and more about it, and focusing on reading Ron Paul and these different contributors, and then I ended up just embracing the idea and realizing that it wasn't so much that I adopted libertarianism, it was that libertarianism adopted me, because it aligned so well with my personal ideology. And so I was really excited for that, but at the same time kind of bummed that I didn't find it earlier, and that I didn't take the time to fully understand exactly what it was. And so, but it all this really comes back to a really dear friend of mine who just asked a simple question. It could have been, she said, "Have you heard of Gary Johnson?" It could have been, "Who was John Galt?" or something. "Have you heard about Ron Paul?" But that's ultimately what kind of brought me into the fold, and we've kind of gone from there.
All right, and I understand you graduated from the University of Scranton, which I was only recently made familiar with because somebody told me it was actually a real town and not just a place the office made up.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us about that and what you were trying to do with that degree program?
So I originally went to Scranton with the intention of being a math teacher, because I wanted to be a teacher, and my favorite teachers in high school were my math teachers for the most part. And then I took calculus, and my tune changed very quickly, because I guess my proficiency for math stopped at algebra. But I ended up switching to English because I realized that rather than studying calculus, I was spending all my time reading and writing. And then I decided to switch to being an English teacher. And then somewhere around sophomore year, I started to get disenchanted with the idea of being a teacher, particularly being a public school teacher. It's, I looked at everything from career prospects, pay, and just in general, if it was something I truly wanted to do. So I ended up just switching, dropping the education portion and just focusing on English. And, at that time, all I knew is I wanted to write. I didn't really consider anything else. But it worked out pretty well. It just took a few years after the fact. But, I pretty much used my time in Scranton to really just focus on my writing and try to find my tone and my voice, which is slowly becoming a little more sarcastic and biting when I'm writing, because my writing is becoming more and more critical of a lot of things. But that's pretty much what I use that time for. So I think at that point, that degree program specifically, I think I wanted to use it to expand my knowledge of literature and writing techniques and just use that. But what I did like about it as well is that it kind of gives you that, a degree like English or history does kind of give you that classical liberal education that you can use really in any field, with the exception of, hard sciences. So that was, really beneficial to me because it gave me the ability to really think critically and expand on ideas and to focus on not just what the text says, but to be able to read between the lines and expand upon it and really infer quickly and easily. So overall, it's definitely a benefit. I'm glad I switched from math because I don't know if I could have. I had trouble with calculus. I don't think I would have done well in calculus 4. A friend of mine showed me her textbook, and I pretty much checked out at that point.
Yeah, well, it's good to know your strengths, and I wanted to ask, because from what you just said, it sounds like you still basically want to be a teacher, because the reason we're talking is I wanted to go over the book that you wrote, and books that you wrote, and one of those books is a book about teaching children their rights, and another book is a book about teaching children how their rights are being violated on a daily basis. So I wanted to ask you, on those subjects, what do you think is the easiest way to get a child to be interested in a book like this? Because a lot of children don't even read, and when they do, they want something exciting, and they want something like, fucking Animorphs or something.
Right.
So,
I remember Animorphs. I read those. Yeah. That and Goosebumps.
Yeah, I was always a Stephen King person, like Goosebumps and Animorphs for like 7-year-old me, but like eight
Mhm.
year old just fucking skyrocketed into fucking hardcore horror shit.
No.
Goosebumps
Uh,
stopped being enough. But
yeah,
go
well,
ahead.
not, I was I went to started getting into Ray Bradbury and Harlan Ellison. That was where I went. But yeah, no, I do think the desire to teach is still definitely around, and it took me a few years to realize that that's something I still wanted to do. Um, as far as getting kids interested in this, what I've found is really interesting, the response we've gotten, especially with the first book focusing on the Bill of Rights, where a lot of kids, especially younger children, do seem to actually find that to be a fascinating subject. A lot of, oftentimes I think civics and the Bill of Rights and things like that, the Constitution, the law, usually turns into a history lesson, which isn't a bad thing. History is important. It's important for context. But I think that's where you have a lot of kids check out. And I think when you start them young, it's a new subject, it's fascinating, and it applies directly to them. And I think that's the biggest thing of drawing the interest of young children, is making sure they understand that this isn't just some, bland information we want to give you, but it's something that directly impacts your life on a daily basis. And that ultimately has, I think, trying to focus on that and just, here's the law, this is what it means to you. That seems to draw a lot of interest from younger kids. And I've had a lot of parents tell me it's actually the younger kids that are asking the questions when they're reading it together. The older siblings will read it, they'll understand it, but they're not trying to drive the conversation. Whereas younger kids, I had one parent tell me that her son was stopping, he was 6, I believe, was stopping after every paragraph to ask a question and to put it in perspective. So I think it's a combination of age and just making it unique to them and showing that this really does impact their lives. And that perks them up, because now the kid says, oh, you want to talk about me? And so it makes it more personal. So I think that's something we want to focus on. And I think for parents that are trying to teach this kind of subject to their kids, they really need to make it tailored to them and make it clear that this does have an impact every day for the rest of your lives. And if you fail to make, stress that importance, the interest tends to go down because it's now information that's not important. So I think that's the main thing we're trying to do, is just stress that importance to each individual, not just a general, collection of information.
Okay, and that's a good answer. I want to read the description on Amazon of one of your books. I think it was your first series, which was "I Know My Rights: A Children's
Mm-hmm.
Guide to the Bill of Rights and Individual Liberty." So the description starts with the rights of every person, every man, woman, and child are inalienable. Though they are written as the law of the land, our rights transcend all of humanity's laws. They are tantamount to each individual living their most fulfilled life. Um, so I wanted to ask you about that because I started reading the book, and one of the things I noticed right off the bat was that this book is heavily um, focused on the Bill of Rights, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because most children are told that the Bill of Rights is where their rights come from. But you would
Right.
insist that the rights don't come from the Bill of Rights. The rights are inalienable, and the Bill of Rights is just sort of secondary to them, right?
Right. And the main thing I've stressed, and I've even gotten some eyebrows raised from some adults that never really considered that perspective. But it's right there. Even the word inalienable, it's right there in our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and we're endowed with these inalienable rights. So really trying to stress the idea to the younger generation that our rights are not a gift from government. You possess these rights simply by existing, as all human beings do. So it's not a question of whether or not these rights exist and whether you're given them. It's a question of whether or not you are born with a state that protects those rights or chooses to try to eliminate those rights. But regardless, for instance, the First Amendment, you will always have the ability to speak your mind and to think freely. The question is, are there consequences? So with the Bill of Rights, we created a series of laws that essentially are geared towards protecting natural rights from the government itself. So it's really trying to drive that point home from the very beginning that no matter what happens, you possess these rights. It's not up for debate. The only question really is, do you live in a society with a state that allows these rights, protects these rights, or chooses to suppress these rights? And so that's why I stressed the Bill of Rights with children and wanted to focus primarily on that with our first book, is these are the laws that protect them. And you have to know these rights or these laws, because the moment someone does try to step on your rights or to encroach, this is what you use to protect them. And without these, then, you end up, living kind of a sheltered or living kind of in the shadows, or the shadow of the state. So that's something we just wanted to drive home from the very beginning, is that you have these rights regardless. These laws are here to protect them. And so that's why we have to stress the importance of maintaining these laws and their integrity.
So, by that score, what I've noticed when I looked through your other writings is, because we could talk particularly about this book for probably 2 or 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've noticed when looking through your writings is you also seem to be very critical of what I guess could be termed government overreach.
Oh, yeah.
For instance, you have a recent, semi-recent article about the death penalty and why it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
You have another article on eliminating distractions from our lives. Where we're arguing about mermaids is a good headline in there.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have something against selective service. So let me ask you, do you believe the concept of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle as a core foundation of your ideas? I mean, I think I have an idea you do, but for the people who aren't familiar with your work, what would you say to that question?
Absolutely. Yeah, the NAP and the concept of self-ownership, to me, really are the bedrock of what I believe. And it's something we stress in my first book, I Know My Rights. It's something we stress at the end of the book, to kind of put it in perspective of how do we live in a society if everybody has the right to live as they choose. How do we live peacefully? How do we coexist with people we disagree with, or people who live in a manner that we would not choose for ourselves? And what ends up happening is you see, we try to stress this idea that you own yourself, and so all interactions must be voluntary, and beyond that, you're free to live as you choose. So it's basically just do no harm. But actually, I'm currently working on our follow-up book to I Know My Rights, and that book is actually going to focus primarily on the ideas of voluntarism and self-ownership. So it's absolutely a big part of what makes up my beliefs.
Okay, and I wanted to ask that because I wanted to ask the necessary follow-up question to the idea that you write children's books, because I'm an anarchist, and I think that many of our shared audiences are anarchist, and I'm wondering how you respond to parents who are critical of your work because it encourages anarchy. Because I do see a strong thread of basic classical liberal thought and some sort of trending to that self-ownership and voluntarist ethos in your writing. And when people reach those natural conclusions and it clicks as parents, are they more offended, or are they more like, oh, never thought about it that way?
So far it's been more of the latter. We haven't really encountered any significant criticism, as far as, oh, you're teaching anarchy, or you're trying to teach minarchism, or just, or resistance to the state, things like that. So we haven't really encountered any significant criticism that way. I do think some parents have figured it out a little bit, that oh, this is the way you're going with this. And what I found is most people tend to embrace that, whether or not they know it, because when they see it, it as you said, it clicks. It makes sense to a lot of people. And it's, oh, right, this is the way it's supposed to be, or the way it should be. Whether or not they truly adopt that, especially, as parents who tend to already kind of be set in their ways, so it's more difficult to change their mindset. You really do end up, at a minimum, seeing this. At a minimum, they're willing to kind of entertain it and consider this line of thinking. And because what I find, so when I talk about voluntarism or self-ownership with someone that was kind of describing what the second book would be, they, and the way I put it is basically just, all social interaction requires consent. All economic interaction requires consent on both parties. And they said, oh, yeah, that makes absolute sense. And, I said, okay, great. So this is what I'm talking about. And so I think these are ideas that everybody can get on board with. It's just a matter of how is it packaged. So it's been pretty positive as far as the response. And and I caught a little bit of your show yesterday with Pete Raymond, and I know he kind of mentioned the same thing when he kind of talks about what voluntarism is or self-ownership. For the most part, everyone seems to kind of agree with that. But it's just a matter of, I think it's just a matter of packaging it the right way and beginning the conversation, and starting to go down that road with everyone.
Okay, and I wanted to ask about that packaging because I've spoken with anarchists of all stripes for about 6 years now, and a little bit before that too, when I was still a small L libertarian politics guy, and many anarchists of a specifically leftward-leaning perspective don't like seeing the founders hailed as like virtuous people. And what I see in a lot of people's writings is that the founders and the U.S. Constitution are considered the beacons of liberty, when for a lot of people, when they look back at that history, they see enslavement, death, torture, medical experimentation, mass land theft, the Trail of Tears. I'm wondering how you comport the support for a voluntarist ethos with still supporting the actions of the founders, or if the founders are just sort of a gateway drug for normies to get into it.
And in a way, I'd never thought about that. It could be kind of considered a gateway drug, and this is a jumping off point, if you will. I do agree that you can't ignore history, and I think you absolutely have to pay attention to it and learn from it. Where the founders promoted such beautiful ideas of liberty and protection under law and things like that, but at the same time very much had their own flaws. And, so that can't be ignored, rather it should be learned from. To say, when you look at the Declaration, it says all men are created equal. And then you look at that period in history and go, oh, clearly that wasn't the case at that time. But I think learning from that history is how we continue to progress. So I do think, regardless, whether or not you accept or reject the founders' vision of what ultimately they were trying to do, at the end of the day, it's a great starting point. And, it's how, we as a society learned specifically from those concepts of liberty that they brought about, that we started to reject the idea of, say, slavery or treatment of Native Americans and things like that. We started as a society to reject them. So in a lot of ways, we're using their words against some of the things that they themselves endorsed at that time in that period of history. So it shouldn't be whitewashed. It absolutely should be learned in full. But I don't think it's necessarily a detraction so long as we learn from it and recognize that, they're not. We can't put them necessarily on a pedestal. They're not perfect. Their ideas were phenomenal for their time, and they still carry that same weight today, I think. But they also carried baggage as everyone does, and unfortunately, in that time period, their baggage was significant, and so it can't be ignored. It has to be brought out into the light, but it shouldn't necessarily detract from their work as well on the foundations of liberty. I think both should be combined and learned from, so that we can make sure we don't repeat those same mistakes going forward.
I think that's a good answer, and I also think that that it could be sort of summed up with not throwing babies out with bathwater. In terms of the ideas that they presented, they were sort of like a post-European Enlightenment kind of thinking, and like I see a lot of sympathy for that kind of thinking in the sorts of people who support Brexit. You want to talk European politics. They see Britain as enthralled to a giant European superstate. Like, the Killing Joke song is relatively perfect in terms of, like, a critique of that. And I see a lot of people who could benefit from that sort of thing. But I also see in others of your writings that you say you're politically agnostic. And what I see in this writing here, being politically agnostic, or put more accurately, apathetic, is not at all uncommon. It's the final result of party politics. Whether intentional or otherwise, our political parties have done a fantastic job of weeding out the agnostic from the faithful. This has left us with the devout on either side bickering over minutiae, while the skeptical look in, afraid and indeed unable to offer an opinion. So, would you say that this polarization right now, where everybody's trying to find the best ways to gotcha and cancel people, is like more of that distraction that you talked about, like arguing about mermaids? Or would you say that it's closer to the style of debate that the founders set forth? If that's the case, then is agnosticism the next step of Americanism or the roots of Americanism?
I think from a purely political standpoint, I think that from a party standpoint, I should say, I think kind of that agnosticism or just that skepticism is well rooted in American history. I mean, even George Washington in his farewell address was highly critical of the idea of political parties. And if you read his thoughts, he actually kind of predicted exactly what we would be today, as far as the bickering and leveraging political power to one's own end rather than for the good of the country. And so I think really the what we're seeing today is not what was originally envisioned. At a minimum, if there were going to be parties and debates, there was, with our founders, there was really an emphasis on civility and respect. So if you look at one example is Jefferson and Adams, both were fundamentally opposed on how the government should be structured. Jefferson was an anti-federalist. He wanted basically just the original Articles of Confederation. He said that's all we need, whereas Adams really wanted that strong central government, and it was the compromise between the two that gave us the Constitution with the Bill of Rights taped to the back. That was really just a combination or a huge compromise. So the political environment today, or the atmosphere, it's definitely become more so. I don't know over the last 50 years if it's become worse or if it's just we're seeing more of it with the 24-hour news cycle and now with social media. I think what's changed a little bit is now you have politicians themselves that are willing to jump on social media and go after their opponents and challenge people with information, and unfortunately the information is relatively useless. We're fighting over little tiny things, and we're not looking at the big picture that affects everybody, because now it's all about pandering and just either making large promises that can't be kept, or just kind of picking on one thing and saying, well, I might not get this done, but he'll make it worse. Well, I'm not sure which is better from that. So, but I think the political environment today is certainly not what was imagined, and I think it's become not so much worse, but just we're confronted with it more on a daily basis, because the channels of communication are rapidly changing through social media, and it's become, because of that, it's become much more of a mudslinging contest and between everybody, but I think division is what politicians ultimately want. Politicians, I know I talk a lot, as you pointed out, about distractions. Ultimately, political division is great for politicians because it shores up their base. It ensures that they're going to get votes and donations, and at the same time, it ensures that they can continue to demonize the other side and, win big from there. So, unfortunately, that's kind of the state, and that's why where that agnosticism comes out. I don't see myself represented by the Republican Party. I don't see myself represented by the Democratic Party. I do like the Libertarian Party. I don't agree with every single thing, like most libertarians, but I do like the idea of having a party that stands on some form of principle and that encourages members to disagree with each other and talk about it and debate it. Because what we're seeing now is not debate. I don't think we've seen debate for years. I think all we're really seeing is temper tantrums and, food fights on Capitol Hill. We haven't had real debates in this country for a long time. If you caught the Democratic debates a few weeks ago, I mean, that by itself was just hard just because of how many people you had on stage, but it really was just soundbite after soundbite. You got 60 seconds, 30 seconds. People either used it to plug their "here's what I'm going to give you" plan, or they used it to just, go after someone else on stage and attack them. And that's not what a debate is supposed to be. A debate is supposed to be, bringing out ideas and, discussing every single facet of an idea or a concept and bringing it to the forefront and allowing people to make up their minds based on all the information, the pros, the cons. And we don't have that anymore. We don't have people trying to raise that level of debate. And I don't think they want to. I don't think any politician would be willing to be cross-examined by a moderator, for 10 minutes until they answer the question. But that was one of my favorite things from the Democratic debate, was a show of hands. I think that's the way it's ultimately going, is do you support this, yes or no? And everyone just stands there quietly like that. At this point, I would rather have that, because it puts you on record of what you do or don't believe and what you do or don't want to do. And then I don't have to listen to 90 seconds of yelling and finger pointing. So yeah, we've definitely come a long way, and unfortunately it's been kind of a downhill way at this point. And I think it's going to require someone of real significance raising the level of debate in the future if we're going to see us get back to, real political discourse and civility.
Yeah, and so I wanted to read what is essentially the conclusion of your first book series about knowing your rights. You said, "It's a lot to remember, and that's why we always have to study our rights. Even adults forget from time to time, and some adults don't know their rights at all. It's important that we keep discussing them as a regular part of your lives. Talk to your parents and teachers, your siblings and friends. Pay attention to your community. Listen to what your elected officials are saying, and talk about what that means for your rights. Having these rights as a person means that we also have a duty to maintain their integrity and protect them. That's how we learn to live peacefully. The older you get and the more you pay attention, the more complicated it will feel, but as long as you keep studying and exercising your rights every day, it will come naturally to you. And now you know your rights." So what I was curious about is, do you think that adults don't know their rights because they weren't taught them as children, so they learned to grow up in a society which rejects them? Or do you think that they don't know their rights because they don't give a shit as long as they can, make other people bend to their will in the ballot box? At least, do what they think is that, even though I don't think voting's all that effective.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. At the end of the day, so I've asked a lot of parents over the last few months, and we're looking at people that are, age 35 through, 70 years old, the people I've talked to, and the majority of them said that they were never taught their rights in the classroom. They took civics, but it was more of a history class. Even if they were taught the Bill of Rights, they weren't given a context for which these rights could be asserted or exercised. So unfortunately, we see a lot of the data too that backs that up. So the University of Pennsylvania did a study 2 years ago, and they found that 37% of American adults don't know a single part of the First Amendment. Like, they can't even name freedom of speech, which is really disheartening. So I definitely encourage parents to take the initiative on their own, to not be reliant on a public school system, and even private schools to a big extent, because there doesn't seem to be any urgency in teaching these rights. And, we can make the argument that could be part of a greater conspiracy to keep people in the dark on that subject. I don't even know if it's that. I think it's more just an inability or an unwillingness to teach it for one reason or another. At the same time, though, I do think there are those that just don't care, because they're either pessimistic towards the concept of having inalienable rights, or they're just uninterested, or they just think it's history. It's not, it doesn't apply to me today, and it very much does. It's still the law, and it's the law from which all other laws emanate from. And if you don't care about that, then that's when people take advantage of it. That's when people step in and they start to usurp your rights. And, that's one of the reasons why now we have, the Patriot Act and FISA and all these things. And it's because nobody, or very few people, stood up at that moment and said, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. And, and I think even today in routine traffic stops, people just don't know that they don't have to get out of the car and allow them to search the vehicle. They don't have to necessarily answer questions. They can just take the ticket. And, so a lot of that has really done a lot of harm to the integrity of our rights, because either through inaction, fear, unwillingness, or just a lack of knowledge, people are slowly deteriorating the integrity of our rights and weakening them, because now there's an expectation that we will either not know or that we'll waive our rights when it comes time. And so we're trying to get the next generation to understand that, no, you have to assert your rights at all times and stand up and say, this is not what I'm going to accept. So I really do encourage parents to take the initiative. And one of my favorite things is, now every now and again I'll get a message from a parent who, sends me, the kid loved the book and they learned so much. And by the way, I had a question. And I love that, because you get adults, they go, I didn't know this. And that's when I ask the question, did you learn it in school? No. Did you ever take the time to learn it yourself? Not really. Okay, but now you're learning it now. So let's start from ground zero and figure this out. So, I remain very optimistic for the future, but, I do think that there's a lot of ground to cover, primarily with adults. I think kids are very interested in this. As I said before, it's the adults that are struggling with it, because they're at a point where they're very set in their ways and they've just never given it enough thought. And now they're trying to relearn it, essentially.
Okay, and that's a good jump off point for another part of your book, which came almost exactly prior to that. So you get done listing and describing the Bill of Rights, and then in the end of this, you have a 3-page section, I want to say, on, well, actually, 2-page section on rights that the Bill of Rights did not cover. Because the Bill of Rights didn't have anything to say about consent. It didn't have anything to say about, voluntarism or, basically the non-aggression principle. And I think that a lot of, there's this quote in your book, as long as a person gives their consent, it's not a violation of their rights. If they don't, then you can't take what's not yours. We can peacefully agree or disagree, but we must respect each other's wishes. So, the founders immediately quelled a tax rebellion. The
Hmm.
and many laws and regulations these days that you cover, I believe, I haven't read it yet, but in your book about silly laws, your latest book that came out, are born from the idea that we can still do these violations of human liberty, these violations of basic rights, and have it be constitutional. So what I'm wondering is, if a child asks about a law that is not unconstitutional as deemed by people like SCOTUS, but
Hmm.
is a violation of rights, um, what do you say to that child in addition to this book? Or is this book mainly a primer and considered a jump-off point for further education of that child?
It is certainly meant to be a primer, and that's something I've talked a lot about with parents. That they, once they read a book like this, go out and buy them a pocket constitution, start reading, go read the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, and really continue to immerse yourself. What's interesting is the founders, a lot of their writing really did talk about this fundamental idea that at no point does the government truly have the authority to just do what it wants, so long as it doesn't violate these 10 rules. But and I think that was one of my favorite amendments is the Ninth Amendment, which points out that not all rights are listed in the Bill of Rights. That just because we numbered these 10 does not mean that there aren't other rights that exist. But to your point with like SCOTUS and everything, there have been significantly poor decisions over time. One in particular that still bothers me is the Kelo decision on eminent domain, and because they said that increased tax revenue could be considered public use. So when talking to kids with that, I think the primary thing is to reinforce the idea with them in that conversation of these natural liberties, and really to focus on bringing about positive change, and basically remaining optimistic. Because I think that's what the next generation really needs to see, is this optimism of, yes, we can make changes, and that, yes, reform is possible, and it really is going to rely back on what we were talking about a minute ago on debate and discussion and civility. But I think if you have enough people that embrace this fundamental philosophy, it's going to become, over time, much, much harder for the government to usurp our rights. And I think, over time, you start to have, when we look at elected officials and offices, you start to have these individuals who do hold tightly this philosophy of liberty. That's where the change is going to come from. So that's kind of what I tell these kids when they come across a law that just doesn't make sense to them, about how's it okay, how's this considered, as you say, constitutional. One of the things I usually say is just, well, go change it, and trying to instill that optimism and saying, okay, so, become an activist, become outspoken, or if necessary, run for office one day, and try to find that support and bring as many people together as possible. Because the more people you have in favor of this philosophy of liberty and these fundamental concepts, as I said, the harder it's going to be for the government to continue usurping our rights and trying to find workarounds or try to circumvent the Bill of Rights. And so that's really what I try to instill, is just that sense of optimism, and really trying to push the next generation to step up, as a lot of us are trying to do. There's just not maybe as many of us right now, but I think over time we're going to see a greater population of people that truly hold these fundamental ideas close.
Okay, so that would be another question. Um, because for a while now, and I get using this as a primer, a jump off point. I get not throwing out babies with bathwater. That makes sense to me. But for a while now, I have asserted, and I wanted to get your feedback on this, that
Mm-hmm.
the Bill of Rights is not only wholly inadequate in a Lysander Spooner sense, but it is inaccurate because we don't have positive rights, we have negative rights. We have
Hmm.
the ability to assert that because we own ourselves, you can't do these things to us. And it seems to me that in your last 2 pages, you make much more of a negative rights argument than a positive rights one. So I'm
Hmm.
wondering if you would see these amendments in the Bill of Rights as a placation for the more negative rights arguments that were present in the Anti-Federalists. Because for anybody who does know the history, because they listen to the history lessons, the Bill of Rights was basically a way to get more signatures on a constitution that otherwise might not have been agreed to. So
Right.
I'm wondering if you could tell me personally whether you support more of a positive rights theory or a negative rights theory, and why.
And I very much support more of a negative rights theory. I really do believe it's from that concept of self-ownership, or that standpoint of self-ownership, it's these are the things you can't do. You cannot violate this. That to me, just in general, makes far more sense, as opposed to the positive rights. So, and I do. Funny because I'm looking now on my coffee table. I have a copy of the Anti-Federalist Papers staring at me. But I do think the Bill of Rights, in a lot of ways, was, I don't know if I'd call it inadequate. I think I'd call it limited. And I think a lot of that stems from there just being less going on in a much smaller country at the time. And there were a lot of ideas that I don't think were ever predicted, or considered. But that's why I do stress that. Like I said, I stress the importance of that Ninth Amendment. But I absolutely think it's worthy of consideration, of just because one of the things about our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, we have the ability to make amendments and we have the ability to make changes to it. So I think looking at it as being limited isn't a bad thing. I think it's to say, okay, so what more can we do, and what more can we guarantee under law if that's necessary? And until we have a system of government that truly has no desire, intention, or power to usurp our rights, it's definitely something we have to consider: is do we have to put this in writing under federal law that you cannot violate any of this? And and personally for me, if I can make one amendment, I'd eliminate eminent domain. That's just that's first on my
Maybe
list.
asset forfeiture while you're at it.
Oh, please. Oh, it's just become such a terrible thing. And I think, what was it, a year or two ago, that civil asset forfeiture had surpassed, in terms of money taken and value, had surpassed national robberies and burglaries. That yeah, those are two things that need to go. But at the same time, you start to see reform. So there's been a couple states this year that have made significant changes to their civil asset forfeiture programs, where they're essentially saying either you can't take it until there's conviction, or they've just drastically limited the powers of the police to seize that property without even making an arrest. So again, I remain optimistic that there are enough people out there with this mindset and understanding, even if they don't put it in the same terms, they understand that this is clearly wrong. And we're starting to see some changes at the state level to prevent this sort of abuse. So I do remain optimistic, but I do think you could easily make some changes to it. There are certainly things that I would like to change in the Constitution itself, specifically I would like to strengthen and reinforce the concept of separation of powers. I would like to really just make a federal prohibition on Congress abdicating its power to the executive branch, which we've seen over the last 50, 60 years, particularly wartime powers. So I really would like to see things like that to strengthen maintaining really somewhat of a decentralized government between the branches. So it is a central government, but having those branches was a brilliant idea that hasn't completely panned out the way it was supposed to. So I think going back and revising and eventually just making necessary changes to strengthen these ideas could be a really positive thing in the future.
All right. And on your death penalty article, you finish it by saying there are many theories on proper punishments for all forms of crime, but providing the state with the authority to kill is neither effective nor acceptable. One dead body will not bring back another. The state is meant to be a mediator focused on finding justice rather than acting as the arm of vengeance. So, I wanted to ask you about that final sentence, because it sounds good, but is the state meant to be a mediator, or is the state meant to be the way by which people enact violence by proxy? I mean, there's a common phrase among libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists of all stripes that every law is a lifted gun. So, is the state really meant to be that, or do we mean for the state to be that when it's an entirely different beast?
And I would say, recalling that article, I would say in my mind is probably, I think that's what the state is meant to be, as opposed to what it actually is. Because I do agree that, with that line that every law is a lifted gun, and so I'm a fan personally of something called restorative justice, or simply just restitution. So there was a wonderful video on YouTube you can find, and it's talking about Brehon law, or Irish law, ancient Irish law. And there's it's a wonderful video kind of explaining how ancient Irish society was one of the original, not entirely, but to a point, and kind of an ANCAP state. And there was no death penalty, there was no imprisonment, and what they focused on instead was restoring what was lost. So if I broke somebody's arm in a fight and they couldn't work, you'd have a mediator come, a Brehon would come and listen to both sides and say, okay, a just decision would be you have to pay his medical expenses. They actually have records of that, where you had to cover the costs of essentially the shaman or the witch doctor, essentially the physician, and then you would cover lost wages, because now they can't work for some time because their arm is broken. There's an agrarian society. So, and we're starting to see in smaller communities around the world something to that effect. I know there's I can't think of where it is now, but there's a small community in Italy, I believe, that focuses on that. They still have a judge, a jury, and members of the community. But if there's a guilty verdict rendered, then it's actually members of the community that come together and sit with both parties and try to work out a resolution. They say, okay, we've proven your guilt in court. Now we need to make up for it. And this is how we're going to figure this out. And they try to figure a way to make amends that's just and equal and essentially restores a balance between the two persons. So that's really what I was thinking about quite a bit when I wrote that article. And I really do think that is what ultimately the state's role is supposed to be in terms of the court system and the justice system, as opposed to just, okay, you've committed a crime, society has been harmed, you're going in a cage for 5 years. That has never really felt like justice to me. I'm not necessarily entirely opposed to an imprisonment system. The problem is it often never fits the crime. And I also have a problem with the idea that society is somehow the victim of an individual's crime. If somebody gets in a bar fight and breaks somebody's arm, in Bangor, Maine, that has no bearing on me, and it probably doesn't have any bearing on the majority of people in Maine. So really, it's not a dispute between society and the accused. It's a dispute between the accused and the victim. And there needs to be a mediation between, once you've proven guilt, you need to find a way to essentially restore that balance between the two. You may never mend the relationship between the two, but I think there's a better chance of having a peaceful solution and just saying, okay, what can we do to make this work between the two of you? So that was heavily on my mind when I wrote that article, and just trying to tell people that we don't need the state to commit violence for us in order for there to be justice. as much as we might want that justice, and the death penalty is the ultimate example of that, where we'll just execute the person and that'll stop. But all you've done is kill another person. And as much as I don't care for what they did, as horrible as their crimes may have been, I just can't see my way anymore to saying that is an acceptable form of punishment. It also costs more. So from a tax perspective, capital punishment is ultimately more expensive. So that bothers me as well. But I think if we can begin to reform our criminal justice system and get away from the state committing violence on our behalf over civil and criminal disputes, and really trying to find that singular solution unique to that incident, then we can begin to have real positive change. And I think overall, I do think that would create a more empathetic society where more people would be aware of their victims and aware of their actions and their consequences. So I think that over time would create really a more peaceful society just in general.
Okay, so just to clarify, are you saying the state shouldn't have the right to kill somebody, well, the ability anyway, because we just went over the fact that rights are negative, the ability to kill somebody in response to, for instance, a capital crime, or in response to egregious injury or something like that, like they're torturing or raping? Mm-hmm. Or do you think that nobody should have that right? Do you think it would be wrong for somebody to enact their Second Amendment rights, as you discuss in your book, to shoot somebody who had just murdered a family member, or to shoot somebody who was raping them or something like that? Or do you think that it's just wrong for the state to be the arbiter of that justice? Where do you draw the line? Are you a nonviolent guy, a pacifist?
I'm not a pacifist. I believe in self-defense. I believe that every individual has the right to protect themselves, and unfortunately sometimes that does involve lethal force. So I don't care for violence. I would really do wish that no one would ever have to use force or violence to protect themselves, that they would never be put in that situation. But I do believe the individuals have the right to protect themselves, even if that means using lethal force if necessary. From the state perspective, I really don't. I really can't see my way to acknowledging the state's right at any point to use lethal force on our behalf, or really violence on our behalf in general. So I would prefer us moving away from that overall, because I think ultimately it ends up being interesting where a lot of, when you look at capital punishment, for example, that's not an act of self-defense. You have someone who is physically strapped to a gurney and at that point really is not a threat to anybody. I don't view that as self-defense. It's just an execution, where somebody in the moment using physical force or lethal force to protect themselves, I think that's a different circumstance. But I would prefer the state not be used as a proxy for us to commit violence, particularly out of vengeance, under the guise of self-defense or the defense of society. We need to move away from that mentality of the state being willing to take matters into its own hands and commit violence. Again, the only exception would be is if you have law enforcement would be in the active defense of an individual who is under attack. But if you have someone who is at that moment not a threat, I don't think you can justify using lethal force. I think you'd have to make an arrest. So I would prefer very much the state to really stay out of the violence game. And if violence is going to be used, I really would prefer it only to be used in self-defense by an individual.
All right, and that brings me to another point you made in your article about selective service. And how the selective service can't justify its own existence. And I agree pretty much entirely. You said government agencies are virtually impossible to eliminate. If they perform poorly or fail entirely, the usual response is to increase its budget, although this is hardly a solution. But if a government agency is at the point that it must justify itself through innocuous repetitions of consequences should a citizen reject participation, it has more than lost its way. Rather than perpetuate the exercise in a submission to government authority cloaked in farcical liberty, let us abolish the draft and adopt a foreign policy based on peaceful diplomacy and free trade, rather than aggression and intervention. Now, I generally agree with that, and it's under a subheading called Declare Your Independence and Abolish Conscription. But it's interesting that you say that the state shouldn't be in the business of violence when the reason that they exist is to be violent, when the reason that the state exists is to do violence on behalf of a people and to be a regional monopoly on said. So I'm wondering, because of what you've said here, and because of what you've said elsewhere, if you support more of I think it was Matt Kibb, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff kind of mentality when applied to all government or just some government, because you say you're a voluntarist and you say it's not okay to breach somebody's consent, but the state does that inherently. So
Right.
I'm curious as to how you comport this rejection of state violence, aggression, and intervention with supporting any sort of state action at all, or if you do oppose the state, and if that's more like a way to express it to the common person that might get them on the road to the same page.
You're exposing my minarchism. I think overall, I think my recognition of the state more stems from the fact that, I kind of hit the genetic lottery being born into a country with the state, and now that we're here, it's more about understanding and learning their playbook and utilizing that to our own advantage and really to our protection. And then from there, trying to bring about positive change. I absolutely love the idea of a stateless society. I really do. For the foreseeable future, I don't know, when it is attainable. I think it's possible. I do believe in peaceful solutions working towards that. So I think it's more about just bringing about the reform that is necessary. And in order to do that, we have to educate ourselves as much as possible on the state itself. But I do love the idea of Matt Kibb's idea that do no harm, don't take my stuff, or don't hurt people, don't take my stuff. And, if it was possible for a state to exist with for one reason or another, without doing harm, without confiscating property, without using violence, that would be phenomenal. But I don't think that would really be possible inevitably, because at that point, why do you have the state to begin with? So I think it's more, my mindset is more just recognizing that the state exists. It existed before me. It will probably exist for some time after me. So for me, it's more learning as much as possible about our particular government and utilizing their rules and their playbook to our advantage and really to our protection, while at the same time trying to bring about as much reform as possible and making those positive changes and moving us away from an over-criminalized society and focusing more on just allowing people to be people. So I think I'm very conflicted every day. I will admit that. Oftentimes where I'll be commenting on politics or law, and at the same time I sit there thinking to myself, oh, just go away. Can't stand you anymore. So I do think in a lot of ways I do have a little bit of contradiction in my head, just a little bit. But I think it's more about recognizing where we currently are in time and just working to bring about as much reform as possible in my time.
All right. Well, with all that being said, I think that's a relatively good introduction to you and your books. Also, I would advise everybody follow him on Twitter at Rory Margraf. That link will be in the description. But is there anything that you want to say to, let's say, the adults and then also the children who might be watching this?
And the biggest thing I can think of right now would be, and I've said this to a lot of people, is that education ultimately is the silver bullet in society. Knowledge is ultimately what gives us our power, and you can't be reliant necessarily on other people to provide you with that knowledge and information. You have to pursue it yourself. So absolutely take the time every day to learn something new, particularly about law and government and how we can protect ourselves as citizens and as individuals, and really just focusing on that every day, basically making it a personal discipline, I think is the most important thing that anyone can do. And it will ultimately, especially for young children, it'll ultimately make you a better person as you grow, to be more mindful and tolerant of others, while at the same time having the force of your convictions and your knowledge and understanding of the world. I think that is ultimately how we bring about positive change in our world and our society.
All right. Well, is there any place that you want people to find you that I didn't mention?
No, I think you got it right. You can follow me on Twitter, and then absolutely go on. You can get my books on Amazon. We have I Know My Rights is for sale, and then our new book came out last weekend as I Am a Free American, right? So it's just a guide to some of our silliest laws. My personal favorite of which is Chesapeake, Virginia. Anyone over the age of 12 caught trick-or-treating could be sentenced to 6 months in jail. That is my current favorite. So, but it's just a really fun illustrated guide. So definitely check that out as well. That came out last weekend, and it's available in paperback, and an ebook should be coming up actually here in the next 72 hours or so.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the book that I've recommended quite a bit, which is like it's something like, man, I can't remember what it's called. It's like basically two English guys went through America and like went on a crime spree of dumb laws. Like you can't fish for whales in fucking what was it, Death Valley.
Yeah, and
Um,
Oklahoma too.
Yeah. So it's always interesting to know that some of these government laws that are on the books are just there to placate one group or another. It's always interesting to sort of probe that for weaknesses. And I hope people check out his books. You can access both of them by the link in the description. And I hope y'all follow him and check out his writings on various sources, including all the sources that I mentioned in my tweet and many more. And I wanted to say thank you for coming on, and I think it's been a great stream.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.